In 1992, police in one corner of South Manchester were recording, on average, 2 shootings every day. The newspapers stopped printing the word Manchester and started printing the word Gunchester. And on a cold weekend, at the very start of 1993, a boy of 14, 6 feet and 1 inch tall, was shot dead through the window of a takeaway as he waited for his food. This is the story of Moss Side, the place Britain came to call its most dangerous neighbourhood, and a place that began its life as somewhere people dreamed of moving to. Because before the guns, before the concrete, before the burning police vans, there was a marsh. The name tells you everything, if you slow down long enough to hear it. A moss, in the old northern tongue, is a bog, a waterlogged stretch of peat and reed and standing water, too soft and too sour to build on, good for little except the low green plants that give it its name. Moss Side was the edge of one of those, a great moss that once spread across the flat land south of Manchester, from Rusholme to Chorlton, dark and wet and empty. The earliest written mention of the place comes from the 1530s, when it sat quietly among the estates of the Trafford family, a piece of nowhere on the way to somewhere else. For 300 years, almost nothing happened here. When Elizabeth Gaskell opened her great Manchester novel, Mary Barton, in the 1840s, she chose this very ground to stand for everything the industrial city was not. She wrote of a rural idyll on the southern fringe of the smoke, a deep clear pool, green fields, and an old black and white timber-framed farmhouse where working families walked out on their rare days of rest. That farmhouse was later identified by name. It was called Pepper Hill Farm. Hold on to that name, Pepper Hill. It is going to come back, more than a century later, in a form nobody walking those fields could have imagined. In 1801, the population of Moss Side was 151 people, a hamlet, a scattering of farms on drained land. But Manchester was the first industrial city on earth, and industrial cities do not stay small, and they do not stay clean. As the mills multiplied and the centre thickened with smoke and sewage and human beings, the people who could afford to leave began to leave, and the flat, freshly drained land to the south, the old moss, was the first dry ground they reached. So Moss Side was built, not as a slum, as an escape from one. Through the second half of the 19th century, the fields filled with brick. Broad avenues of solid villas went up for the merchants and managers and professional men who wanted air in their lungs and a garden for their children and a carriage ride between themselves and the factory. Around them came street after street of red brick terraces, tighter and cheaper, for the clerks and shopkeepers and skilled working families who aspired to the same respectability. It was a genteel place, a proper Victorian suburb, and at its heart, the city laid out something magnificent. Alexandra Park opened to the public in 1870, 60 acres of ornamental grounds, a serpentine lake, a bandstand, gymnasia, and the first sunken bowling green in Manchester. It was considered the showpiece of the city's Victorian parks, a green cathedral for a rising suburb, and the 2 grand roads laid along its flanks were named in honour of a princess. Princess Road, Alexandra Road, the names of a neighbourhood that believed in its own future. This was the Moss Side that produced Emmeline Pankhurst, born on the old Alexandra Park estate in 1858, the woman who would lead the fight for votes for women. This was the Moss Side that in 1923 welcomed a football stadium so vast it could swallow 85,000 people. They built Main Road on the site of an old brickworks, and for 80 years the great stands of Manchester City rose over the terraced streets like the walls of a fortress, and on match days the whole neighbourhood filled with noise and colour and the smell of frying onions. If you had stood in Alexandra Park in 1900 and looked around you at the villas and the bandstand and the promenading families in their Sunday clothes, and someone had told you that this exact ground would one day be called the most dangerous place in Britain, you would have laughed in their face. So how does a place like that fall? Slowly at first, then all at once. The first crack came from the sky. On the night of the 22nd of December 1940, German bombers came for Manchester, and the terraced streets of Moss Side took their share of the damage. The Blitz did not destroy the neighbourhood, but it marked the beginning of a long unravelling, because the war that followed drained Britain of money, and the peace that followed the war drained Moss Side of its comfortable families. The people who had money began, once again, to move out to the newer, cleaner suburbs further from the centre, to the semi-detached dream with its own garage and its own drive, and the villas they left behind, those big proud houses built for a single family and a handful of servants, did not stand empty for long. They were carved up, divided into bedsits and rented rooms and lodging houses, one family to a floor, then one family to a room. The gardens went to weeds, the paint peeled. The showpiece suburb quietly became a place of transience and cheap rent, and the city planners, looking at the damp and the overcrowding, began to reach for a word that would define the next 30 years of Moss Side's life. That word was clearance. But as one community drained out of these streets, another was arriving, and for a while it made Moss Side sing. After the war, Britain needed hands to rebuild itself, and it called to the people of its empire to come and help. From the Caribbean, from Jamaica and Trinidad and St. Kitts, came the Windrush generation, crossing an ocean on the promise of work and a welcome that too often failed to materialise. Many of them, arriving in Manchester, found their footing in the cheap rooms of Moss Side. By the 1980s, this was the beating heart of the city's Afro-Caribbean community, and it had a culture all its own. There was the Reno on the corner of Princess Road and Moss Lane East, and the Nile upstairs above it, the most famous drinking clubs the city's West Indian community ever had, where the music went on past dawn and a new kind of British culture was quietly being born. There was the Manchester Caribbean Carnival, which began in the 1970s when families of Trinidadian and St. Kitts origin came together for a procession through the streets, and which still fills Alexandra Park with dance and colour every August to this day. For a generation of children, Moss Side was not a byword for anything, it was simply home. It was aunties on the step, and food you could not get anywhere else, and the whole neighbourhood turning out for the carnival. And it was into this living, breathing community that the planners now drove the bulldozers. The idea, on paper, was pure kindness. The old terraces were genuinely worn out, damp and cramped and short of bathrooms, and across south central Manchester, through Hume and Moss Side, the council had drawn up one of the largest slum clearance programmes in Europe. They would sweep away the tired Victorian streets and replace them with something modern, something visionary, something that would lift the poor into the light. And just to the north of Moss Side, in Hume, they built the monument to that dream. They called them the Crescents. 4 enormous curved blocks of deck-access flats, 6 stories high, completed in the early 1970s, and they were named, without a trace of irony, after the great architects of Georgian England, Nash, Adam, Barry, Kent. The designers had looked at the elegant sweeping crescents of Bath and Bloomsbury and decided to rebuild that grace in concrete, with raised walkways in the sky where neighbours would stroll and children would play, safe above the traffic. It was meant to be one of the finest housing schemes in Europe. It became one of the worst housing disasters in British history. The concrete that was supposed to look clean and modern turned black in the Manchester rain. The heating, an experimental underfloor system, failed almost immediately, and then the oil crisis of 1973 sent fuel prices soaring, and families who could not afford to heat their flats watched the damp bloom across the walls. Cockroaches infested the blocks from below. The elevated walkways, meant to be streets in the sky, became wind tunnels and dead ends where nothing good happened out of sight of a window. And the design carried a horror in it that nobody had foreseen. The balconies had a gap in the concrete that curious children could climb. And in 1974, a 5-year-old child fell to their death from one of them. 643 residents signed a petition begging to be moved. By 1978, the chairman of the council's own housing committee stood up and said the thing out loud. The development, he said, was an absolute disaster. It should never have been planned. It should never have been built. Families were rehoused as fast as they could be found somewhere to go, and the flats were handed instead to students and single adults and the poorest and most desperate people the city had, until the estate became, in the words of those who lived through it, a dumping ground. Moss Side did not get the crescents. Moss Side got its own version of the experiment, the Alexandra Park estate, thrown up through the 1960s and 70s on the western side of the neighbourhood. Low-rise blocks and walkways and pedestrian decks laid over the ground where the villas had stood. And around all of it, the planners drove their new roads, wide, fast dual carriageways, Princess Parkway slicing north to south, the Mancunian Way flyover sealing off the top of the district. The roads that were meant to connect the neighbourhood to the city instead walled it off from it. Residents described the exact same feeling in Hume and in Moss Side alike: cut off, marooned, left on the wrong side of a motorway, in a maze of concrete that outsiders never had any reason to enter. Here is the bitter mechanism at the centre of this whole story. The slums were cleared to save the people who lived in them, but clearance scattered the old communities to the four winds, broke the invisible web of neighbours and family and shared streets that had held people together, and then concentrated the poorest and most vulnerable into isolated concrete estates that the rest of the city learned to avoid. The cure did not treat the disease. The cure deepened it. And by the end of the 1970s, the ground was ready. All it needed was a spark. The spark came in the summer of 1981. Britain was in recession, and the recession fell hardest on places like this. Unemployment across Moss Side was running at around 30%, up to 3 times the national average, and among the young black men of the neighbourhood, it was reported to be far higher still. These were young people with no work, no prospects, and a police force that many of them experienced as a source of harassment rather than of protection. The old sus laws let officers stop and search anyone on mere suspicion, and in Moss Side that power fell, again and again, on the same young black shoulders. The resentment had been building for years. That summer it had already exploded elsewhere, Brixton in April, then Toxteth in Liverpool, burning through the first week of July. On the streets of Moss Side there was a sense that Manchester could not simply sit it out, and late on the 7th of July, as the Nile Club emptied into the night, the story goes that a small group of young black men were taunted by 2 white men, jeered at that there could never be a riot in Manchester. Within hours that taunt had been answered. On the 8th of July 1981, a crowd of more than 1,000 young people, black and white together, besieged the Moss Side police station. Every window in the building was smashed. 12 police vehicles were set alight, and when a second wave came at the station, a police officer was struck in the leg by a bolt fired from a crossbow. A weapon out of the Middle Ages loosed on an English street in the age of the motorway. Shops burned all the way down Princess Road. The Chief Constable of Greater Manchester was a formidable, controversial man named James Anderton, and his first response was restraint. He pulled his officers back, kept a low profile, and gave community leaders time to calm the streets. For 2 nights it did not work, so on the 3rd night, Anderton unleashed the machine he had been quietly assembling, a mobile task force of 560 officers, packed into 50 vans and Land Rovers using vehicle tactics that until then had only been seen in the streets of Northern Ireland, sweeping through the district with the back doors hanging open, snatching anyone they could reach. In 2 hours, 150 people were arrested. Anderton later said, with pride, that he had hit the rioters fast and hard and crushed the riot in a single night. But there were bitter allegations of what that show of force had really involved. Residents and lawyers described police vans cruising the streets, officers leaning out to hurl racial abuse and beat anyone they found. A senior councillor called the events of that summer the death of the community, and an argument began then that has never fully ended over what those 3 nights actually were. The authorities called it a riot, the work of criminals and outside agitators. Many who were there insisted it was something else entirely. It was, they said, the rage of a community that had been unemployed, over-policed and abandoned for a generation, finally boiling over into the open. Whichever it was, one thing was certain. Whatever trust had existed between Moss Side and the law was now gone, and into a neighbourhood with no work and no faith in the police, a new economy was about to move. If you are following the story of how a place falls this far, stay with me, because the next part is where the name Gunchester was born. And if these deep dives into the hidden history of British places are the kind of thing you find yourself thinking about afterwards, take a second to subscribe, because this channel exists to tell exactly these stories. Now back to Moss Side and the small cul-de-sac that gave a gang its name. When legitimate work vanishes, illegitimate work fills the space, because the rent still has to be paid and the children still have to be fed. Through the 1980s, the drug trade took root in south-central Manchester. First cannabis, then heroin, then the crack cocaine that would turn a street business into a war. And the geography of that trade mapped itself precisely onto the concrete the planners had built. On the western side of the Alexandra Park estate, there was a small ordinary cul-de-sac of semi-detached houses with an alleyway at one end. It was called Gooch Close. Young men gathered around a shebeen there, an unlicensed drinking den, and sold what people wanted to buy. And from that unremarkable little street, they took a name that would come to mean gunfire across the whole of Britain, the Gooch. And on the eastern side of the same estate stood a pub. It was called the Pepper Hill. There it is again, the name from Gaskell's rural idyll, the black and white farmhouse in the fields, carried down through a century and a half of history to hang over a pub on a 1970s council estate. The regulars who sold drugs from around that pub became known as the Pepper Hill Mob. And when the police shut the pub down and pushed them out, they simply regrouped a few streets away, around a road called Doddington Close, and gave themselves a new name, the Doddington. The old idyll had become a battlefield, and it had kept its name the entire way down. The Gooch and the Doddington divided the estate between them, west and east, and then they went to war over it. And the reason they went to war is almost too small to bear. It was money, yes, at first, the fantastically lucrative drug trade that reportedly ran into millions of pounds a year. But as the 80s turned into the 90s, the shootings stopped being about business at all. They became about respect, about insults, about a girl, about a stolen bike, about nothing. Young men killing young men in an endless cycle of retaliation, where every death demanded another, and where the guns had become so ordinary that they were reached for the way an earlier generation would have reached for their fists. The police fought back. In August of 1991, Operation China swept up 23 of the leading gang members, and by the following year they were in prison on drugs and weapons charges. For a moment there was even hope of peace. Older figures from both sides met and talked of a truce, and there is something almost unbearably poignant in the detail that survives from that moment. That rival Gooch and Doddington men actually played football together, as if the thing might yet be settled like a schoolyard quarrel. It was not settled. The truce collapsed, and the younger ones moved up to fill the space the arrests had made, and they were more reckless than the men before them. The names of the dead began to pile up. In April of 1991, 17-year-old Carl Stapleton was attacked with a machete on the Alexandra Park estate and died of his wounds, and the trial of the men charged with his murder collapsed when a witness was too frightened to testify, and no one was ever convicted. That was the pattern that would define everything that followed. Everyone knew. No one could say. And then came the killing that gave the nightmare its name. At the very start of 1993, a 14-year-old boy named Benji Stanley walked into Alvino's takeaway on Great Western Street to buy patties and dumplings. Benji was not a gangster, he was a schoolboy, unusually tall for his age at 6 feet and 1 inch, and the leading theory has always been that his height was his death sentence, that a gunman took him for someone older, someone who mattered in the war. A man in a balaclava fired a shotgun through the shop at point-blank range, and Benji Stanley died on the floor of the takeaway while his friend ran home so fast he said he could not remember his feet touching the ground. No one was ever charged, but something in the country broke that day. The death of a 14-year-old, gunned down waiting for his dinner, was a horror the whole nation could see, and hundreds marched through Moss Side demanding that it stop. It was around this killing that the press fixed the label that would follow the neighbourhood for the rest of the century and beyond. Not Manchester, Gunchester. The violence did not stop. Almost exactly a year later, on New Year's Day of 1994, a prominent young Doddington man named Julian Stewart was shot dead in the street. And because he was a known gang figure rather than an innocent child, his death barely made the papers at all. That was the other, quieter horror of Gunchester, a place where a killing had to involve someone entirely blameless before the wider world would even look. In the autumn of 1993, the leader of a national political party, Paddy Ashdown, came to Moss Side to see the crisis for himself, and it was reported that as he walked through the rundown shopping precinct, he was confronted by a teenager brandishing a submachine gun. Whether that account was exact or embroidered by the retelling, it captured something true about how far things had gone. This was a British neighbourhood where a boy might wave a machine gun at a party leader in broad daylight, and the numbers tell the same story, coldly. In 1996, South Manchester recorded 28 confirmed shootings, with 12 people wounded and 4 dead. The following year, 68 shootings, 39 injured, 6 dead. And in 1999, more bullets were fired across Manchester than in any year before it. At least 270 shots counted from the casings left in the streets, most of them in Moss Side and Hume and Longsight. Of all the shootings in this period, only a tiny fraction ever led to anyone being convicted, because the wall of silence held. To speak to the police was to sign your own death warrant, and everybody knew it. For a while it seemed the wall would never come down. The new century arrived and the killing simply mutated. The gang splintered into ever smaller factions with ever more names. The Longsight crew, the Moss Side Bloods, the Old Trafford Crips. Children now, some of them fighting over fragments of streets. And in September of 2006, the neighbourhood was forced to relive its very worst day. A 15-year-old boy named Jesse James was cycling through Moss Side when a gunman hiding in bushes shot him dead. Like Benji Stanley 13 years before him, Jesse had no gang record, and like Benji, he is believed to have been killed by mistake, taken for a member of a rival crew by boys who did not even know his name. And like Benji, his killers were never brought to justice, because when the police came asking, they met the same wall of silence they had met for 20 years. A coroner even named suspects aloud at the inquest. Still no witness would formally come forward. But something had, at last, begun to shift beneath the surface, because the tide, when it finally turned, did not turn because of one dramatic raid. It turned slowly, the way the decline had come, through a patient, unglamorous, grinding down of the machinery of the war. A dedicated police unit, working with the community rather than against it, began the long work of rebuilding the trust that had died in 1981. Prosecutors learned to protect their witnesses, moving the biggest trials 35 miles away to Liverpool so that the people brave enough to testify could not be reached and frightened into silence. The breakthrough came in the courts. Two men, Colin Joyce and Lee Amos, had risen to the top of the Gooch, and after a fresh wave of shootings on their release from an earlier sentence, they were put on trial in what became the largest gang prosecution the city had ever seen. In April of 2009, Joyce and Amos and 9 other members of the Gooch were found guilty of a catalogue of crimes including murder. Joyce was told he would serve at least 39 years. The city's chief prosecutor called the verdicts a moment of enormous significance for public safety, and for once the language was not an exaggeration. With the leadership removed and the trust slowly returning, the shootings that had defined Moss Side for a generation began, finally, to fall away. So walk through Moss Side today and try to find the war. You will struggle. Gooch Close, the little cul-de-sac that gave a gang its name and sent that name around the country, has been redesigned and quietly renamed. It is called Westerling Way now, an ordinary street where nothing announces what it used to be. The Pepper Hill pub, where the mob was born that carried the name of Gaskell's farmhouse into infamy, has been closed and reborn as an Islamic community centre, a place of prayer standing on the site of so much bloodshed. Main Road, the great stadium that watched over all of it, was demolished in 2003 when Manchester City moved east, and where 85,000 people once roared, there are now streets of new houses and a primary school. The Alexandra Park estate itself has been rebuilt and reshaped, the blind alleys and hidden walkways deliberately engineered out of existence, designed so that violence has nowhere left to hide. The park is still there. 60 acres of Victorian ornamental grounds, the same serpentine lake, and every August the carnival still fills it with music, exactly as it has since the 1970s, exactly as the community that was blamed for everything intended it to. The streets are quiet now. The shooting statistics have collapsed. By the ordinary measures, Moss Side is simply another inner city neighbourhood, no longer a place the whole country fears, and yet the name will not let it go. Ask people across Britain what they know of Moss Side, and many of them still know only one word, still picture only the guns, still see Gunchester when they look at a place that has spent a generation becoming something else. That is perhaps the final, quietest cruelty in this story. The violence lasted around 20 years. The reputation has lasted longer and shows no sign of lifting, which returns us at the end to the ground itself, to the old moss, the drained marsh that people built on to escape the dirty city, that they filled with villas and a beautiful park, that they let slide into bedsits, that they cleared and rebuilt in concrete, that they cut off with motorways, and then blamed for its own despair. Through every single one of those lives, the land kept its name. Pepper Hill Farm in the pastoral, the Pepper Hill pub on the estate, the Pepper Hill mob in the war. The same syllables carried across 2 centuries, from a deep clear pool in a novel to a shotgun blast in a takeaway. Moss Side was never simply the most dangerous neighbourhood in Britain. It was a place that a city built to escape itself, then broke, then feared, and that its own people, the ones everyone else had written off, quietly put back together. The guns are gone, the park is full again, and the reputation the rest of the country pinned to these streets is now the last thing left to bury. If you found something here worth thinking about, YouTube reckons you will like the video already waiting on your screen. Go on, it is a good one.